Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The seven mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Recent political moves in the Middle East are setting up the rise of Mystery Babylon. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me to discuss what exactly is going on with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his recent moves, very energetic, very ambitious, very gutsy, possibly very stupid, if some analysts are to be believed. If you've been following the news, as you know, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has arranged for the arrest of dozens of potential rivals to his claim to the throne of Saudi Arabia, plus many other ministers and government officials in Saudi Arabia that he considers a threat. It's possible that what he's doing is just eliminating rivals, but he also appears to be shaking them down in order to restock the coffers, the treasury of Saudi Arabia, which has taken a hit because of the drop in oil and natural gas prices over the last few years, which the Saudis engineered to try to put the hurt on Iran. Despite that, Iran has been successful in establishing, for the first time ever, its Shia land bridge connecting Tehran to the Mediterranean coast through Iraq and Syria. The Islamic State is all but out of Syria at this point, and Iranian-backed militia units have had a large part to play in that. The Saudis are not keen on this idea, and it appears that MBS, as observers call him, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is trying to work with Israel to put together a plan to counter this, which could involve going to war, a Sunni-Shia conflict in the Middle East. Well, to try to make sense out of all this, especially from a prophetic standpoint, we bring in a scholar who has written extensively about this, who's been watching the Sunni-Shia conflict and also keeping an eye on the Sunni power to the north of Mesopotamia, that being Turkey, the former home of the Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. The author of the book Mystery Babylon, among many other books on Bible prophecy, Joel Richardson. Joel, if those reports coming out of the UK via the Daily Mail about Mohammed bin Salman's willingness to collaborate with Israel in provoking a war against the Shia power in Lebanon, Hezbollah, how do you see this shaking out, and what implications does this have for the Middle East?
Well, in a lot of ways, if I can say that this is good news, this actually is good news. The bottom line is right now what is emerging in the aftermath of the relative American vacuum, or the vacation of the United States from the Middle East, this vacuum that's been created, is we're having the emergence, the reemergence, if you will, of the old Sunni-Shia clash. And right now, the two primary alpha dogs in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia, and they are the alpha dog on the Sunni side, and then, of course, Iran on the Shia side. Now, this is incredibly important to understand that right now, Iran controls Iraq, they control Baghdad, they control Syria through Bashar al-Assad, they control Lebanon through Hezbollah, and, of course, Yemen through the Houthi rebels. So they effectively control 4 foreign capitals. Now, the way that Iran always functions is through proxies. They are very patient, very calculating. They play the long game. And so in Lebanon, Hezbollah is Iran's strongest proxy. So now if Saudi empowers Israel, because Israel doesn't like this Iranian power right on its northern border, if Saudi Arabia empowers Israel to fight against Hezbollah, then this is just the outflow of this Iranian-Saudi clash. But again, it's fought through proxies. The reason I say it's good news is because we don't want it to become a full-scale war. We'd prefer it to be fought through the proxies. If Saudi and Iran do enter into full-scale conflict, it will most likely completely destroy the global economy. And so this clash is inevitable, but we're hoping that it will be fought on slightly cooler temperatures through proxies and so forth. And who better but to empower than Israel, of course.
This would be a real change because Saudi Arabia, as the site of the most holy sites of Islam, has not had diplomatic relations with Israel. This would be a significant change. And in fact, one of the government officials in Israel over the weekend, in an interview with, I believe it was Channel 10 in Israel, and I could be mistaken about that, but anyway, essentially confirmed that there have been back-channel communications between the Netanyahu government and the government of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan. This is a huge shift. How will the rest of the Islamic world, do you think, respond to the idea that Saudi Arabia is now making peace with the great Zionist enemy?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And first of all, let me just say this has actually been ongoing for a few years. The Saudis have been in rapprochement with Israel because of the emerging Iranian threat. Foreign policy is always at its foundation. It is essentially self-interest. And of course, the Saudi self-interest, if it means partner with Israel to protect themselves from this emerging Iranian power, then yes, they would do it. However, how will it affect the rest of the Islamic world? And this is critical. In my most recent book, Mystery Babylon, I essentially present the possibility that the city of Mecca and the kingdom of Saudi Arabia is actually the fulfillment of Revelation 17 and 18, the prophecy of the great harlot. Well, of course, eventually, the beast, this is the Antichrist coalition of nations, turns on the harlot and burns her flesh and devours her. And so people always ask, they go, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would an Islamic coalition of nations attack Saudi Arabia? But as we see, Saudi Arabia has been in bed with the United States. You could say the little Satan or the great Satan. And for them to get in bed with Israel, the great Zionist satanic entity, as it's viewed throughout most of the Islamic world, this is another reason why the emerging future caliphate, if you will, would turn on Saudi Arabia. It's specifically because of who they're in alliance with.
Now, you have also made the case that Turkey is a nation that we need to watch, and that Erdogan, of course, through his neo-Ottoman ambitions, is somebody who's a dangerous character, not somebody that we should be cozying up to, somebody that NATO would be better off without. How will Turkey, which was the home of the Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, until 100 years ago, respond to the Saudis making this kind of a power play?
Yeah, so beyond the two alpha dogs of Saudi Arabia and Iran, we also have the third sort of dark horse, and that's Turkey. And of course, Turkey is a Sunni power. And for over 500 years, the Ottomans ruled the Middle East, and that included that whole west coast of Saudi Arabia, the cities of Mecca and Medina. And so we need to understand that when the Saudis emerged, these Bedouin tribes, and they took over the Arabian Peninsula, eventually in the aftermath of the collapse or the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the Saudis just declared themselves to be kings. And they said, oh, we're a kingdom. You know, they had not been kings previously. This was just a made-up kingdom. And so Turkey has a very long memory. The Turks, they want to bring back the Ottoman Empire, and they believe that Saudi Arabia is their land. And so I argue in some of my books, Mideast Beast, for instance, that Turkey will be the leader of this coming Antichrist coalition of nations, that Turkey will once again revive the caliphate. It will be at its head. And so this beast coalition of nations, it's very natural, if we look at the geopolitical landscape in the earth right now, it's very natural that a Turkish-led coalition would turn on Saudi Arabia, not just because of history, but also because of who they're in alliance with, and also because of the hypocrisy of the Saudi princes, the fact that they are declaring themselves to be the purest form of Islam, and yet they live as hypocrites, as pigs. You know, they have their alcohol, their harems, their condos in Morocco, and cocaine parties, and all the kind of things. And the whole Islamic world knows it. And so it's very natural that an emerging Islamic coalition would turn on the Saudis.
There's a guy I want to ask you about, because his name has come up in conversation a couple of times around here recently, and that is the Muslim cleric who's living in exiled here in the United States in the Poconos. That's Fethullah Gulen, who runs the largest chain of charter schools here in the United States, something like 130 schools. They've been investigated by the FBI for sending money back to Turkey. And of course, President Erdogan of Turkey blames Gulen for the failed coup attempt, which we talked about at the Prophecy Conference in Colorado in 2016. What is going on there? And what's the internal situation with Erdogan? How did he come out of that failed coup attempt? And how much control does he really wield over Turkey's future?
Yeah, well, Erdogan has emerged little by little, step by step, as the undisputed dictator of Turkey. Now, stepping back in history, we need to understand that when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, he was the secular reformer that founded the Turkish Republic and abolished the caliphate. When he was implementing his very brilliant system of checks and balances, there was another cleric named Bediüzzaman Said al-Nursi. Nursi, in my opinion, is the most brilliant of all of the Islamist thinkers. So you think Sayyid Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, Maududi, all of these different guys that founded, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, Lashkar al-Taiba in the Indian subcontinent, all of these different groups, very few people discuss al-Nursi. Nursi is the father of Turkish Islam, and he knew that in order to take on the West, in order to take on Ataturk, Kemalism, he needed to create a kind of Islam that was custom tailor-made to be received by the West. It emphasizes religious dialogue. It emphasizes science. It emphasizes a veneer of moderation. So we need to understand what Turkish Islam is. Fethullah Gulen was a student of Nursi, and he took the baton from Nursi. So he really was the father of Islamism in Turkey, and he has taken that thing so much further. Now, Erdogan, the current AKP party, the Islamist party in Turkey, they rode to power on the backs of the Gulenists, the disciples of Fethullah Gulen, this Islamist who's living in the Poconos. And so then, when the time came, 2013, the riots broke out across Turkey. A lot of the secularists were protesting, and the government cracked down on them hard. In fact, I was there in Taksim Square. It was May 15th, 2013, the most violent night of the crackdown. We got caught in the whole thing. And Gulen started criticizing the government. Well, dictators don't like to be criticized. And so this is when the fracture, this is when the turf war broke out. And within just a few years, Erdogan effectively carried out sort of the Turkish version of the Night of Long Knives. And he has now used the failed coup as an excuse to purge Turkey of these people that he rode to power on their backs, because he wants to be the undisputed dictator of Turkey, and he's been wildly successful. He's arrested and put in jail well over 100,000 people. People are continuing to this day, disappearing from the streets, being kidnapped. Women, children, old men are dying in prison. Truly, Erdogan is the emerging Adolf Hitler of our time.
Wow. Well, one final question here for our Skywatch TV audience. The near term, with tensions ratcheting up between the Arab League, they had the emergency session last weekend in which the Saudis said we need to confront Iranian aggression. And with the back-channel communications confirmed between Israel and Saudi Arabia, what do you see in the near term happening in the Middle East?
The near term is the danger of a full-blown Iranian invasion of Iraq and Syria. Now that ISIS has essentially been cleaned up by the Kurds, they see an open door. In fact, they've essentially taken over a good section of the Kurdish territories in northern Iraq. And that danger of, not through proxies, but a full-scale Iranian invasion, that is the greatest danger. Again, if it's not full-scale, it'll be through proxies. That's what we need to watch for. And ultimately, it's not just the emerging Saudi-Iranian conflict. In the long term, it's the Turkish-Iranian conflict. But in the short term right now, it's Iran and Saudi. Long term, Iran and Turkey.
And now we continue with the extended interview for the View from the Bunker audience. And Joel, appreciate you hanging around a little bit longer as we're heading into the holiday weekend here. Wanted to ask you about this then, as we look at the conflict of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39. This is something I've been doing some reading on lately, and coming late to the party, I still catching up on some of the details here. In looking at a map of the nations that Ezekiel talks about, obviously Gog of Magog, which of course you've written about and you graciously shared your insights with me, it's pretty clear that the nations that he mentions, Gomer and Beth Togarmah and et cetera, are coming from what is today Turkey, that was the ancient land of Anatolia. But he also mentions Persia, which is Iran, Kush, which is to the south, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Put, which is Libya to the west. How do we interpret those? I mean, are we literally talking about those nations, or did Ezekiel have something else in mind?
Yeah, and so when we are looking at prophecies like this, important prophecies like Ezekiel 38, 39, the question becomes, how do we interpret and understand the names of the nations that are listed? And I would argue a very simple approach is we look at how those names were understood by Ezekiel. He was a biblically literate. His worldview was formed by the Hebrew table of nations in the Bible, as well as, to a degree, where they were in his day. And as you mentioned, most of the names listed in the prophecy were in the area of Turkey, as well as a bit of Syria, and you could say Armenia today, sort of that western and southern section of Turkey, Antioch, kind of heading down there, because it actually mentions that when the birds of the air, the beasts of the field feast on the flesh of Gog Magog, it refers to Magog's hordes as strong bulls of Bashan. Or it refers to them as fattened calves from Bashan. Of course, Bashan being northern Israel, Syria, that kind of area. A lot of people miss that point. But the point is this, is we correlate them, the names, to where they were in Ezekiel's day, and we correlate them geographically to where they are today. It's not about trying to trace down bloodline lineage and going on this incredibly detailed historical wild goose chase and trying to rely on the scant historical evidence that we have and the intermingling and intermarriage of peoples. That just becomes a nightmare. A very simple approach is we simply go, where did Ezekiel understand the names to be? Where are those locations today?
I'm going to put a graphic up on the screen here so people can see this. I think when you look at a map, and this is my take on it, because he was obviously wanting to make a point to the people who are reading it in the 6th century BC when he was writing, but also for our day today. But if you just draw arrows on the map from the directions of the nations that he mentions, it's pretty clear, in my opinion, that what he's saying is the whole world is coming to war against Israel and specifically against Jerusalem in the last days, because he's basically mentioning north, east, south, and west, basically the nations that in his day would have been considered pretty much the ends of the earth.
Yeah, it's essentially he's saying from the four corners of the earth, the 4 points of the compass, if you will. However, he does emphasize Turkey as the leader from the north. And, you could say that's sort of the outer perimeter of this coming massive coalition. It's certainly not a comprehensive list, because he says, and many nations with you. So sometimes people go, well, these are the only nations listed, but there will be others listed. There will be others included as well.
And I think the fact that he mentions the sides of the north or uttermost parts of the north, we translating that in English, will draw a line straight north, and that's where a lot of commentators, especially after World War II, came up with the idea that it had to be Russia, and especially with the Hebrew word Rosh in the sentence, which just means head, as in Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. But when you look at that phrase translated as sides of the north, Yerkat Sephon, and the other places where it's mentioned in the Bible, it appears that what he's actually referring to is the mountain that was known in the ancient world as the site of the palace of Baal, which again is in Turkey. Yeah, and you shared that information with me. That was new information to me, and that's absolutely fascinating to get a little bit of the historical background to some of what would have been understood and recognized by Ezekiel and his contemporaries, but it also gives insight into some of the spiritual dynamics that are taking place behind the scenes with this coming invasion. Yeah, because it is a supernatural conflict ultimately. I mean, as you point out in your book, the Second Temple, Jews of the Second Temple period understood that Gog was considered the last enemy, the end times enemy, the great end times enemy of Israel.
Yeah, and consistently when you look at all of the earliest commentaries, whether Christian or Jewish, on this passage, it's not until much more recently that people began looking at Gog Magog as a preliminary invasion distinct from and different from the Antichrist. All of the early Jewish writings, all of the early Christian commentaries, all saw Gog as the Antichrist or the final invader, whether Gog is a term that's more used for the spirit behind the Antichrist or this sort of thing. Essentially, he is the leader of this coalition. He's not a different individual. It's basically the same story. Ezekiel is telling the same story that Joel, that Zechariah, that all of the other prophets are telling. It's actually a much more simple story than we often make it.
Well, since Joel and Zechariah are putting that apocalyptic conflict there at Jerusalem, then do we conclude then and agree that the war of Gog and Magog is essentially the battle of Armageddon, which will be fought for Mount Zion at Jerusalem?
Essentially, the way I articulate it is I say the battle of Gog-Magog, the invasion, it culminates with Armageddon, because in both passages you have the conclusion of the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, the call goes out, come feast on the flesh of kings, warriors, princes, etc., etc. You have in both conflicts, you have a mighty earthquake and great hailstones. There's a period after the hailstones fall that they're still blaspheming. It's not until Jesus effectively silences them in judgment that they stop blaspheming. They blaspheme right up until the bitter end. But it's interesting that in Ezekiel, there's a great earthquake at the conclusion, and it says, and all of the mountains will fall. Well, then in Revelation 19, the return of Jesus, you have another prophecy where all the mountains will fall. Well, if this is a prophecy which concludes several years prior, which a lot of people say, how can all of the mountains fall twice? And I would argue that this is clearly the same great earthquake.
The reason I just reacted the way I did is my first book was essentially about the importance of cosmic or holy mountains in this supernatural struggle, and the fact that Mount Hermon and Mount Zaphon, Yerkat Zaphon, play an important role throughout biblical history. But even beyond that, some of the gods of the ancient world, for example, the chief god of the Mesopotamian Sumerian pantheon, Enlil, was specifically called Great Mountain. So I think there's a dual meaning here, that all of these other, of course, where did Muhammad get his revelation? Jebel al-Nur, the Mount of Enlightenment outside Mecca. All of these other mountains will fall, and the only one remaining will be God's Har Moed, his Mount of Assembly, Mount Zion.
Amen, amen. Yeah, and just a few verses later, a few passages later there in Revelation 21, then I was taken to a great and high mountain, and there I saw the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. So in the end, his mountain will be chief and exalted among all the mountains of the earth.
The thing that's just really incredible to me is I go back and I've been studying a lot of this pagan cosmology from the ancient world, the nations around Israel specifically, because that helped form the worldview, the milieu in which the apostles and prophets lived, is that you see that God, of course, knowing the end from the beginning, saw all of these false gods, these small g gods, and the rituals that their followers performed for hundreds and thousands of years. And then when you read the Bible, suddenly some of these things begin to make sense, even down to things like, why did he have them march in a circle around Jericho? Why, this on this particular, the transfiguration on Mount Hermon? Things like that suddenly make sense. It was God essentially saying, okay, you've been doing this for thousands, now watch this. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's interestingly to see in Mecca, when they circumambulate around the Kaaba, of course, Muslims claim that this is a practice that goes back to Abraham. No, actually, there's no precedent for this in the context of worship. This actually goes back to ancient Buddhism and Hinduism, the most raw early forms of paganism. And you can see that pagan practice still being carried on today in the city of Mecca, which, of course, they believe is the gate to heaven. They call it the Bab al-Jannah, which is similar to Babel, the gate to heaven, if you will. That in their cosmology, they think that's the closest point to heaven.
Well, let me interject this and give props to my wife, Sharon, for finding this as she was researching her novel Blood Rights and doing some research into the history of Mount Hermon. She found that the explorer, Sir Charles Warren, the British explorer in 1869, when he climbed the summit of Mount Hermon, not only found an ancient temple there, which dated to the Roman period, he found a stela that was inscribed in Greek, probably 3rd or 4th century BC, saying, "By the order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here," a reference to the Watchers on Mount Hermon. But he also found a much older stone wall that led to the summit of Mount Hermon and forced people approaching the summit to circumambulate the mountain, the summit, in a counterclockwise fashion. So in 1869, in his report for the Palestine Exploration Fund, Sir Charles Warren speculated that perhaps the Muslims, who, according to a story he'd been told by one of the imams that he had encountered either in Damascus or Jerusalem, now I forget, but speculated that because the Muslims had a legend that there were 5 stones from holy mountains in the Kaaba, the Mount of Olives, Mount Ararat, Mount Carmel, Jabal al-Nur, and Mount Hermon, that perhaps the practice of circumambulating the Kaaba originated on Mount Hermon. Now, we don't know that for a fact.
Wow, sort of the original pagan mountain.
So a possibility.
Well, I'm looking forward to your new book, Derek. Some amazing research you've been digging into.
It's surprising how much the secular scholars know that they don't care to share with us, maybe because they don't like what we do with it. But Joel, appreciate your time today and appreciate your insight and your works. You have persuaded me that Mystery Babylon will in fact be Islam and Mecca. I think it fits the evidence that I'm turning up. So appreciate it. Appreciate your friendship. Wish you and your family a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll talk again.
Okay, to you as well, Derek. Lord bless you. Thanks for having me on.
Joel Richardson's website is joelstrumpet.com, joelstrumpet.com, and do recommend the book Mystery Babylon. He makes a good case. I am in agreement that Islam and Mecca make very good candidates for being the Babylon the Great of the Book of Revelation. I do have different ideas about the identity of the Antichrist, but that's for another program. Hope you have enjoyed your holiday weekend. By the time you see this, Sharon, or hear this, that is, Sharon and I will have recorded a new episode of PID Radio for the first time in about a year. Just a lot going on in the supernatural realm, spirit realm, we think. Things going on behind the scenes of the news headlines that you've been seeing and hearing. So we wanted to address those, and seemed like the best place to do it. So that will have been posted, and you'll find that at PIDradio.com. So PID Radio, even though most of what we're doing these days is on Sci Friday at Skywatch TV, not quite dead yet. And of course, our weekly Bible study, Gilbert House, the Gilbert House Fellowship, online at gilberthouse.org. We've been going through line by line, reading the Bible in chronological order, which is based on the best estimate of scholars as to when those books were actually composed, or rather the period of history that they cover. So when you go through the Old Testament, you'll find that we start with Genesis 1, we get to about Genesis 11, and then we break from Genesis, go over to the book of Job, because Job probably lived earlier in history than Abraham. So before we start back with the patriarchs, we deal with the book of Job and go from there. So that's how we're going through, and it makes the Bible really interesting in a different kind of way when you read it that way, because you start juxtaposing, for example, the history of David with the Psalms that he's credited with writing. So you get more insight and understanding in those Psalms as to what was in his heart, what was on his mind, when you put those together with what was going on in his life at that period. So you'll find all of those studies posted online, free to download at gilberthouse.org. That's gilberthouse.org. We've got a bunch of travel lined up for the year 2018. We will be, first of all, let me tell you that the DVD sets from the Blessed Hope Prophecy Forum in Norman, Oklahoma back in October, those will be shipping in January. You can get those, all of the speakers, 33 speakers, well, I think 32. There's one late cancellation. But every presentation by every speaker will be on the DVD set. Unlike the live stream where they just got the 2 main rooms, this will cover all of them. So you'll get, 6 presentations between Sharon and me. Josh Peck was there as well, but also Tom Horn, Gary Stearman, L.A. Marzulli, Dr. Randall Price, Bill Koenig, Rabbi Jonathan Kahn, Tim Alberino, Carl Tykrib, Ken Johnson, J.D. Farag, Dr. Michael Lake. More, I won't read all of them here. I probably read about half of them so far. Anyway, you'll find information on how to get that DVD set from our friends at Prophecy Watchers. That's online at prophecywatchers.com. Now, the next conference we'll be speaking at will be in Dallas. We will return to the Hear the Watchman conference coming up in Dallas, March 22nd through the 25th of 2018. That's at the Hilton DFW Lakes Hotel and Executive Conference Center, as it was last year. Great venue, great lineup this year. Rabbi Zev Porat, again, coming back from Tel Aviv. Bill Salas joins us this time. Pastor Carl Gallups, L.A. Marzulli, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Michael Lake again, Josh Peck, Pastor Casper McLeod, Sharon and myself. You'll find more information and registration information online at hearthewatchmen.com. That's hearthewatchmen.com. Of course, next year we've got the Year 70 Tour of Israel coming up in May. Dr. Michael Heiser and his lovely wife, Drina, joining Sharon and me as we lead a group through the Holy Land. We'll see Mount Hermon. We'll see Tel Dan, the Grotto of Pan, Qumran Caves, Jerusalem, of course, and the way the schedule sets up right now, we will be in Jerusalem on the 70th anniversary of Israel's independence. And we will be filing reports via video and audio from Israel during this tour. Got more travel to tell you about coming up very soon. The Israel tour, I think, is already filled. I think that's already filled. So if you're just finding out about it, I'm sorry, but that filled up very quickly once we announced that Mike Heiser was joining us on this tour. But we've got another tour coming up that we'll tell you about very soon. So hang on to that. And, last thing to tell you about, the new book that I was honored to co-author with Josh Peck, The Day the Earth Stands Still. It's about the UFO disclosure, ET disclosure movement and its origins in the occult. That is available for pre-order now. It will be officially released December 1st. It's available as part of a great package for Christmas. It includes not only the book, The Day the Earth Stands Still, Josh Peck's new edition, Unraveling the Multiverse, which includes his first two books, Quantum Creation and Cherubim Chariots, in one volume. Unraveling the Multiverse, both of Mike Heiser's novels about the UFO phenomenon and what's really behind it, The Facade and the Portent. New editions from Defender Publishing, plus exclusive video interviews that had never been released before, featuring Gary Stearman, Chuck Missler, Joe Jordan, Paul McGuire, Mike Heiser, Guy Malone, Russ Dizdar Standale, Chris Putnam, Daryl Sims, the alien hunter. That was the most remarkable 45 minutes I've spent in an interview pretty much ever. L.A. Marzulli and Joyce Aarons, whose story you may have seen years ago on an episode of a program called Sightings, about her, the terror of being an abductee. What is really behind the movement? What's really going on here? It's a 5-DVD set that's going along with this package. You can find out more information at skywatchtv.com or at skywatchtvstore.com. Again, the new book by me and Josh Peck, The Day the Earth Stands Still. Please, if you have a few moments, give us a like at Facebook or give us a review at iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else you find us, which is, of course, wherever fine podcasts are sold. And A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is by Kevin MacLeod. His website is incompetech.com. The opening announcements by D.C. Good. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.